That made me uncomfortable. Okay, so I've never done this before, but a lot of students are gone, so I'm showing this. Now, this is going to be on YouTube, so you can watch it later. We're going to just talk through the planning sheet, and I'm going to do one example argument for both of them, kind of what we're going to be doing with this. So I shared all this information with you on your Google Drive, so you should have the planning sheet and notes for both stories. So right here is a copy of the planning sheet. And as you can see, this stuff right here are the arguments of why the story is a good example of realism. And I just pulled these right off of the notes. So these are just characteristics of realism, and this is going to be the basis of your argument. Okay, so what you're going to do right here to begin with, in this section, you're just going to write in a couple sentences what this story is about. So with Silk Stockings, it's a story about a woman who is formerly in her life, she had a lot of money and was quite well off, and then she got married and had kids, and her life is terrible now. So she spends her time trying to be very careful with her money and making sure that she makes every penny go as far as it can. She's very diligent with her money. She comes into possession of $15, and after really carefully thinking through all the things she wants to do with it, she decides to spend it all on herself. She has a great day where she feels very important, and then at the end she never wants to go home to her husband and children again. It's a happy story. So, writing you don't need to write that whole thing, obviously, but just kind of thinking through what is important about the story in regards to realism. Down here, I'm going to have you think through what you're going to be putting in your argument. Okay, so we're going to talk through one quick argument for each of the stories. So what you can do is you can have a copy of your notes for Wagner, because we just gathered all the information you'll need for that, and then a copy of Silk Stockings and all the notes you need for that. So, for instance, right here, our argument 1, and you can put these in whatever order you want, shows the details of life when they are unpleasant. Okay? Now, what you're going to do is you're going to look through your notes. For the Wagner story, what you're looking for is descriptions of probably Nebraska here. You're trying to prove the most unpleasant details about how hard life is. So you're looking through this, and as you can see here, you've got a lot of quotes to choose from. You don't need to write about all of these, but you have a lot of evidence that you could choose from. So what you're looking for is the evidence that makes that life in Nebraska seem as hard or unpleasant as you possibly can. So for instance, right here, the water where they got from the lagoon where the buffalo drank and their slender stock of provisions was always at the mercy of bands of roving Indians, and for 30 years my aunt had not been farther than 50 miles from the homestead. You don't necessarily know if you're going to use all of that information, but you can highlight it, hit Control-C, and then you go back to your planning sheet. Put down here a little bit, and then you hit Control-V, right? And then you go back to your notes. And here's another good one. This is talking about a description of her house, right? And it says, I saw again the tall naked house on the prairie, black and grim as a wooden fortress, blah, blah, blah. It's a ugly place to be. Copy, paste. And put it in right here. After you find 3, 4, 5 of these quotes, and again, it's kind of up to you depending on how much you have to say about them, then when you start to write your paper, you know you can start your paper with one reason that Wagner Matinee is a good example of realism is it shows the details of life even when unpleasant. Some very unpleasant details provided in the story describe Aunt Georgiana's life in Nebraska. And then you start talking about these quotes. You would say, for instance, quote, their water was gotten from the lagoon where the buffalo drank. And then you're explaining in that paragraph, right, how that detail shows that this is an unpleasant detail of life, thus proving that this is a good example of realism. Okay? And, I mean, especially as you start to have more and more sources for your papers, this is a really good way to do it, because you gather evidence from all your sources, just as we did from that story, and then you start to lay it out like this. And so for me, I always like to type up my notes and type up my quotes. You can typically find full-text versions of any story or novel or even nonfiction text that you would use in other classes online, and then you can just copy and paste them. And once you do this for all 4 or 3 of your arguments, you know basically how much you have to say, right? And one point that I wanted to hit again from yesterday, you are not writing a 5-paragraph essay, right? So instead of paragraph 1, I just want you to think argument 1. So right here, this could be 2 paragraphs worth of information on this first argument about showing the unpleasant details of life, right? So as many paragraphs as you need to prove that point. Then you would go on to the second argument. Okay, so if you're writing about a pair of silk stockings, you could show unpleasant details of life. You pull up your silk stockings text, which is over here, and you could talk about descriptions of Mrs. Summers, right? And you could say, the neighbor talked of certain better days that little Mrs. Summers had known before she'd ever thought of being Mrs. Summers. Hit Control C, you go into your planning sheet, which is over here somewhere. Oh, and now my computer's freezing out. But anyway, you get the point. Then you would copy and paste that into your notes. Once you do that for all 4 of your arguments, or 3 of your arguments, it depends on how much you have to say, then when you start to write your paper, you're just explaining how the evidence you chose proves the point that you're making in your paper. Okay? So I'd highly recommend filling out this sheet, this planning sheet first. It's not necessarily an assignment. I'm not going to make you turn it in, but I think if you do it, it's going to make life a lot easier for you. Okay, so in class tomorrow, when you start typing, just take a look at your argument. One other thing I would say, sometimes for me, writing the introduction or the beginning of a paper is the hardest part. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you start and you got your name in the heading typed up and you just freeze and you spend 15 or 20 minutes thinking of how you're going to begin. For me, I want to be productive when I write, and so if I know one of these arguments about the unpleasant details of life and I can just start that and I can type 3 or 4 paragraphs pretty quickly in 15, 20 minutes and then be done, start with that, right? You don't need to start at the beginning. Sometimes for me, writing the beginning at the end after I know all the things that are in my paper makes the beginning go a lot easier, okay? So the next couple days we'll be doing this in class, and as long as you are using your time, I'm happy to give it to you. I'll start later in class today, kind of go around and check in with you and see if you have questions, and then we'll do that tomorrow as well. Thank you for watching.